For the year 2020, I'm making a video review for every new movie I watch, whether in theaters or at home, and on May 8th, I watched The Shawshank Redemption. Welcome to my year in movies. This is Talking to Myself. Based on a Stephen King novella, The Shawshank Redemption tells the story of Andy Dufresne, a banker who is framed for the double murder of his wife and her lover. He goes to serve his 2 life sentences at the bleak and sadistic Shawshank prison, run by a very corrupt and religious warden and a violent and horrifying captain of the guard. While there, he does his best to maintain a sense of hope and purpose, dreaming of the day he'll be free. He befriends a fellow prisoner who goes by the name Red, played by Morgan Freeman, who narrates the film. This film ended up being very difficult for me both to watch and to review because the entire time I was watching the film, I got so distracted by the realities that these characters were living. And I'll get more into that later. But writing down my thoughts on like the performances, the cinematography, whatever, it felt disingenuous because it felt like I was ignoring all of the horrors of the realities of being in prison. This ended up being a really heavy movie, even though I would argue that of the heavy movies, like Requiem for a Dream, Fruitvale Station, things like that, this is one of the more accessible ones, but it was still a lot to sit through. Having never seen it before. Now, this is considered one of the best movies of all time. IMDb has it as like the top rated film of all time. Do with that what you will if that matters to you. But what was fascinating was I found out that this film was like poorly received when it was first released. It released to really lackluster reviews. 2 of the more scathing reviews of the film actually criticized it for humanizing prisoners, which is another detail we'll get into in just a bit. So I do want to talk about some of the performances. Tim Robbins is really good. He has a very effective, quiet demeanor. He does a really good job of doing a lot while saying nothing. I've not seen Tim Robbins in a lot of things. I just know that he's super tall. But he's really good in the film. Morgan Freeman is flawless. He's charismatic. He's engaging. Seeing the way he carries himself, seeing that change every time his character goes to his parole hearing just sticks with me so strongly. It's actually all of his lines in his narration that I've seen parodied and referenced. There's an episode of Phineas and Ferb actually that draws very heavily from this movie. It's where they switch bodies with the aliens. So all of the narration that happens in that episode, they lift from this movie. Clancy Brown, whom I adore, he's wonderful. I love him in everything that he's in. I say I love him in everything he's in. That doesn't necessarily mean I love the characters because, oh my goodness, is Captain Hadley just horrifying. Like he's spine chilling. I had seen scenes of his character in isolation before, but seeing them in context just elevated it. He's monstrous but so effective. And speaking of Hadley, that's a good segue into saying that the use of violence is very effective in this movie. The movie was more restrained than I thought it would be with its violence. But that doesn't mean the violence isn't brutal. Like the first time we really see violence, just unflinching, is when Captain Hadley beats a man to death. And it's limited in what's actually shown. Like that's, in that moment, it's backlit, so we only see the silhouettes. And it escalates from there, and it's just so terrifying because that violence is always a possibility whenever he's in the scene, and that the scene will probably end with violence as soon as he enters. But it's so like I found myself cringing further and further back into my couch just because it was so much. This movie makes every minute of its runtime count. And it put me in that place of bleak hopelessness. As I understand, it was supposed to be like a hopeful, uplifting movie, get busy living or get busy dying. And it's known for being a hopeful movie. But the longer I watched, the more I just felt crushed. This film is set between 1947 and 1967, I believe. And I am not confident that the lives of prisoners has improved since then. Prison reform matters to me. Like that's one of the political issues I do actually care very deeply about. And this film made it so I couldn't get the realities of prison life out of my mind. And the way they're treated on the inside, the way that they don't have any resources or opportunities outside, and that's if they get out. The film serves as a poignant reminder of all of that. To better illustrate how deeply this film affected me, I am going to spoil the outcome of two characters. If you haven't seen the film already, I don't think knowing this ruins the experience. If anything, it kind of prepares you for it, I guess. So the character of Brooks was the first instance that my stomach started to sink. He mentions to Andy that he came into prison in the early 1900s, I think 1905 specifically. 50 years later, he gets his parole. He was in prison for 2 world wars, and the prison just expects him to transition into the real world. Like, he leaves, and it occurred to me that, like, cars weren't widely used when he went to prison, and they're, years ahead when he leaves. He spends all of his time out of prison. He struggles to adjust to the real world. All of his time is spent contemplating how to break parole and go back. And eventually the inability to adjust to the real world, his inability to adjust to a world that he hasn't seen for more than half of his life. It becomes too much and he hangs himself. But Tommy is what broke me. Tommy enters probably halfway through the film for burglary. He goes to Shawshank. It's 1965 now. With Andy's help, he finishes his GED. I believe he mentions having a wife and son on the outside. I forget. He also happens to know who really killed Andy's wife and her lover. Now, by this point in the film, Andy has proven to be indispensable to the guards and administrations at Shawshank. He has proven that he's very good with tax documents, with money, and the warden is using him as a tool in his money laundering scheme. After Andy unsuccessfully tries to plead his case to the warden and say he should be able to get a retrial, because if someone has evidence, if someone has a testimony of who really killed his wife and her lover, he should get a retrial, which means he should be able to get out. And he's punished for speaking up to the warden, and the warden summons Tommy to ask him about it. And I had a bad feeling when Tommy went to go meet with the warden at night in an empty lot. But as soon as the warden asks him, would you be willing to testify to this in court, he has Tommy shot. Like I said, I had a bad feeling, but I wasn't prepared for how that was gonna make me feel. And that was the breaking point. I couldn't not cry, and I couldn't stop crying the rest of the movie because it was so bleak and hopeless, and these guys are stuck in prison and they can't do anything. They can't win. Watching this movie was such an ugly reminder of how awful the prison system in America is. And it's a reminder of how ugly and messy the issue of prison and justice reform is, because you want to make sure justice is served to victims and their families. But I have a hard time believing the best way to rehabilitate people is to put them in a box where they're abandoned and treated as less than human. And we claim that prison is, a punishment, it's a place to do their time, but as soon as they get out, they don't have the skills or opportunities that they need to get back on their feet. And so recidivism is a horrible problem. This is something where I wish I could do something, anything about it. And like, this was supposed to be an uplifting, inspiring film because Andy gets out. But that's Andy. Andy gets out. But there are people who die in prison, and there are people who die in prison serving sentences way disproportionate to their crimes, and I wanted to be inspired, but the only feeling I had was just, it just hurt. And I cried because it's so bleak. It's such a bleak situation because it's not a sexy issue. It's not an easy solution. It's just so broken. And like, of course it's a good film. It's a great film. I think the film does a good job of broaching the topic of showing how prison life is awful and showing that the people inside are still human. I want to do something, anything. I'm researching ways to start I'm looking at things I can do. There are resources that talk about forming a pen pal relationship with prisoners. I started watching this guy on YouTube. He's a former convict who's dedicated his life to education about prison reform, about what it was like being on the inside, and educating people to try and prevent crime. Larry Lawton, he's got some good resources. His content was recommended to me by a friend, so thank you so much for bringing that to my attention. This film also reminded me a lot of Fyodor Dostoevsky's prison memoir, Notes from a Dead House. I know that sounds really pretentious, but it did make me think of how Dostoevsky approached writing about criminals, and just writing about being in prison. This film was inspiring insofar as it inspired me to want to do something. I want to do something, anything, because I don't want to live in a world where you surrender your humanity when you go to prison. It's one thing to argue about the voting rights of felons, but when they lose their humanity, I don't know, it just doesn't sit right with me, and it never has. I'm glad I watched this film. It was a worthwhile experience because it brought all of this back to light and reminded me that this is still a problem. 70 years, and this is still a problem. There's some links in the description. One of them is for a video from Pop Culture Detective, who talks about how the Shawshank Redemption humanizes prisoners and how that was deemed a very controversial choice, and also a video from Larry Lawton. It was really, really informative. But yeah. Our prison stood at the edge of the fortress, right by the fortress rampart. You could look at God's world through the chinks in the fence. Wouldn't you at least see something? But all you could see was a strip of sky and a high earthen rampart overgrown with weeds, and on the wall sentries pacing up and down day and night, and right then you would think that years would go by, and you'd come in the same way to look through the chinks in the fence and see the same rampart, the same sentries, and the same little strip of sky. Not the sky over the prison, but a different, far off, free sky. Beyond those gates was the bright, free world. People lived like everyone else. But on this side of the wall, you pictured that world as some sort of impossible fairy tale. Here you were in a special world unlike anything else. It had its own special laws, its own clothing, its own morals and customs, an alive dead house. A life like nowhere else, and special people. Yes, you could learn patience in that place.
Welcome to Shawshank.
This has been My Year in Movies. Thank you for watching.